The horse beneath Kade Lawson was lathered in sweat, its flanks heaving with each labored breath as the Rio Grande came into view through the mesquite trees, shimmering in the late afternoon sun of 1879 like a ribbon of salvation that would wash away every mistake he had ever made. He pulled the reins hard, the animal skidding to a halt on the dusty Texas soil, and turned in the saddle to look back toward Madisonville, knowing that crossing that river meant freedom from the murder charge hanging over his head, but also knowing that somewhere in that town behind him, a woman with chestnut hair and desperate green eyes was trying to protect two children who were not hers from a monster who called himself their father. Kade had only meant to pass through Madisonville 3 weeks ago, another dusty Texas settlement where the general store sold stale hardtack, and the saloon watered down the whiskey. He had been riding north from San Antonio with enough money from a cattle drive to last him through winter, planning to find work on a ranch somewhere in the Oklahoma Territory where nobody knew his name or cared about his past. The September heat had been relentless that day, turning the main street into a shimmering haze, and he had stopped only to water his horse and buy supplies. That was when he saw her. Nora Newton had been standing outside the mercantile with a small boy clinging to her skirts and a baby balanced on her hip, her face turned away from a tall man whose voice carried across the street with the kind of cold authority that made people look away. Kade had been tying his horse to the post when he heard the man say something about the children being better off in an orphanage, about how Nora was nothing but the hired help and had no right to interfere in family business. The woman had stood straighter then, her spine rigid beneath her simple cotton dress, and said in a voice that trembled only slightly that she would see him in hell before she let him take those children anywhere. Kade had told himself it was not his concern. The West was full of family disputes and domestic troubles, and a man who went poking his nose into other people's business usually ended up with a bullet in his back. But something about the way the woman held that baby, protective and fierce, with the little boy pressed against her legs, had made him pause. Something about the fear in the children's faces and the casual cruelty in the man's eyes had reminded him of his own childhood, of his mother trying to shield him and his sisters from a father whose fists were quicker than his tongue. He had walked away that day, collected his supplies, and ridden out of town. But that night, camped under the stars 10 miles north of Madisonville, he had not been able to sleep. The woman's face kept appearing in his mind, those green eyes blazing with defiance even as her hands shook. The little boy's thin arms wrapped around her skirts, the baby's downy head tucked against her shoulder. The next morning, he had turned his horse around and ridden back. It had taken him less than a day to learn the whole sorry story. Madisonville was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the handful of decent folks in town were more than happy to tell him about poor Nora Newton. She had come to Madisonville 2 years ago from Louisiana after losing her family to yellow fever, looking for work and a fresh start. The Halstead family had hired her as a nursemaid for their 2 children, 4-year-old Thomas and baby Sarah. By all accounts, Margaret Halstead had been a kind woman who treated Nora more like a sister than an employee, and the children had thrived under their combined care. Then 6 months ago, Margaret had died in childbirth, the baby stillborn. Her husband, James Halstead, had not grieved long. Within weeks, he was drinking heavily and spending his evenings at the poker tables in the saloon, losing money he did not have. The children became an inconvenience, a reminder of the wife he had lost and the responsibilities he did not want. He started talking about sending them east to an orphanage, about selling the small ranch Margaret's family had left her and moving to California to start fresh. Nora had refused to let it happen. She had stood up to Halstead, threatened to go to the sheriff, to write to Margaret's family in Houston, to make noise until someone listened. In response, Halstead had stopped paying her wages, claiming she owed him room and board for staying in his house. He had forbidden her to leave the property with the children, posting his ranch hands to watch the roads. Nora had become a prisoner, and Thomas and Sarah along with her. The good people of Madisonville had clucked their tongues and shaken their heads, but nobody had done anything. Halstead owned the largest cattle operation in the county, employed half the men in town, and had the sheriff in his pocket. Interfering would mean losing jobs, making enemies, risking livelihoods. So they looked the other way and told themselves it was not their problem. Kade had spent 3 days watching the Halstead ranch from a distance, learning the patterns of the hands, noting when Halstead rode into town and when he returned. He had finally approached the house on a Sunday morning when Halstead was sleeping off a Saturday night drunk, and most of the ranch hands were in town. Nora had answered his knock with suspicion in her eyes and a kitchen knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. But when he told her he wanted to help, something in her face had cracked open like parched earth receiving rain. They had talked for an hour in hushed voices while the children napped, and Kade had learned that Nora was 24 years old, that she had grown up on a sugarcane plantation outside New Orleans, that she had lost her parents and 2 younger brothers to the fever within a single terrible week. She had come west because there was nothing left for her in Louisiana except memories and graves, and she had poured all the love she had left in the world into caring for Thomas and Sarah, because they needed someone to love them as fiercely as she had loved her lost brothers. She had also told him, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, that she was terrified Halstead would make good on his threats, that he would drag the children away while she slept and she would never see them again. She had nowhere to go, no money saved up, no family to turn to. She was trapped, and every day the walls were closing in tighter. Kade had found himself making promises he had no business making. He would help her get the children away. He would make sure they were safe. He would handle James Halstead. He had not planned on it ending with Halstead dead. It had happened 5 days ago, on a Thursday evening when the sky was bruising purple with an approaching storm. Kade had gone to the Halstead ranch to discuss a plan with Nora, using the excuse that he was looking for ranch work if anyone stopped him. He had found Halstead in the barn, drunk and mean, with Thomas cowering in a corner and blood trickling from the boy's split lip. Halstead had been ranting about disrespect, about children who did not appreciate what they had, about hired help who put ideas in young heads about running away. Kade had seen red. He had crossed the barn in 3 long strides and grabbed Halstead by the collar, yanking him away from the terrified child. Halstead had swung at him, wild and clumsy with drink, and Kade had hit back. Once. Twice. A third time that connected with Halstead's jaw and sent him stumbling backward into a support beam. There had been a sickening crack, and Halstead had slid to the ground, his head twisted at an angle that meant his neck was broken. It had been self-defense. It had been protecting a child. But Kade knew that would not matter to the law. Not when Halstead had money and influence, and Kade was just a drifter passing through. The ranch hands had been at the far end of the property fixing fence line, but they would be back soon. And there were no witnesses, except a frightened 4-year-old boy, who would not be believed over the word of respectable white men who worked for a respectable white landowner. Nora had found him standing over the body, Thomas clutched in his arms, and she had not screamed or fainted like some women might have. She had taken one look at the situation, grabbed his arm, and said they had to run. Now. Together. They had packed in a frenzy, throwing clothes and supplies into saddlebags, wrapping Sarah in blankets, lifting Thomas onto the back of Halstead's best horse. Kade had taken all the money he could find in Halstead's office, knowing it was theft but not caring, knowing these children would need feeding and Nora would need a roof over her head wherever they ended up. By the time the ranch hands returned and discovered Halstead's body, they were already 5 miles away, riding hard toward the Mexican border. That had been 5 days of running. 5 days of covering ground as fast as they dared, with Thomas riding behind Kade and clinging to his waist, and Nora cradling Sarah in her arms as she struggled to keep her horse at a gallop. 5 days of sleeping rough under the stars, of rationing water and jerky, of looking over their shoulders for any sign of pursuit. 5 days of Kade watching Nora sing softly to the baby when Sarah cried, of seeing Thomas slowly start to smile again, of feeling something in his chest grow warm and dangerous every time Nora looked at him with gratitude and something deeper in her green eyes. They had reached the Rio Grande yesterday evening, exhausted and trail-worn, and made camp in a grove of cottonwoods 1/2 mile from the water. Mexico was right there, so close Kade could taste it. Once they crossed, he would be beyond the reach of Texas law. He could disappear into the villages south of the border, find work as a vaquero, maybe even make a new life for himself. But Nora and the children could not come with him. She had told him as much last night, sitting by the campfire with Sarah asleep in her arms and Thomas curled up against her side. Her voice had been quiet but firm, brooking no argument. She could not take Margaret's children to Mexico, could not raise them in a country where they had no legal rights, no protection, no future. She needed to get them somewhere safe in Texas, to Margaret's family in Houston if possible, people who would welcome Thomas and Sarah and make sure they grew up with opportunities and education and all the things they deserved. People who could petition for legal guardianship and make sure no distant relative of Halstead's could ever claim the children or the property Margaret had left them. Kade had argued with her. Houston was 200 miles northeast, and by now the whole county probably had wanted posters with his face on them. Traveling that far with him would put her and the children at risk. She needed to hole up somewhere safe while he crossed the border, and then she could make her way to Houston on her own. Nora had looked at him with tears shining in her eyes and told him she could not do this without him. She had no money for train fare, no wagon, no provisions. She had 2 small children who needed constant care, and she was just one woman. She needed help getting to Houston, needed someone to watch their backs, needed someone strong and brave enough to see them through. She needed him. Kade had not slept that night. He had stared up at the stars and thought about the border that was so close, about the freedom that awaited him in Mexico, about the life he could build south of the Rio Grande, where nobody cared about a dead cattleman in Texas. He thought about the risk of traveling northeast toward Houston, about the very real possibility of being caught and hanged for murder, about orphaning these children again by getting himself killed. But he also thought about Nora's face in the firelight, beautiful and exhausted, and so incredibly strong. He thought about Thomas's small hand slipping into his own as they rode, about the way the boy had started calling him sir, and then Mr., and then, yesterday, something that had sounded almost like Kade. He thought about baby Sarah's gummy smile when he made funny faces at her, about how Nora had whispered thank you every night before they slept, her voice breaking with emotion. He thought about the fact that somewhere between Madisonville and the Rio Grande, between watching Nora comfort crying children and seeing her stand guard while he slept, between the moments when their hands brushed as they passed water canteens, and the times when their eyes met across the campfire, He had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. And he realized that he could not leave her. He could not ride across that river and spend the rest of his life wondering if she had made it to Houston safely, if the children were thriving, if she ever thought about the cowboy who had abandoned her when she needed him most. He could not choose his own freedom over her safety, his own life over the lives of two innocent children who had already lost so much. So now, with the Rio Grande gleaming in the sunlight and Mexico beckoning like a promised land, Kade Lawson turned his horse around and rode back toward the cottonwood grove where Nora was breaking camp with the children. She looked up as he approached, her face going pale. "Kade, what are you doing? You should be across by now. You should be. I am going with you to Houston," he said, dismounting. His voice was steady, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "All the way, whatever it takes." Nora set Sarah down in the nest of blankets and stood slowly, her green eyes searching his face. "You cannot do that. They will catch you. They will hang you for what happened to Halstead." "Maybe," Kade said, "but I am not leaving you and these children to face the road alone. I am not crossing that border without you." "Kade, please be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," he interrupted, stepping closer to her. "Nora, you asked me last night if I would help you get to Houston. I am saying yes. I am saying I will see this through to the end, whatever that end might be." Her breath caught. "Why? Why would you risk your life like this? You do not owe us anything. You have already done so much." "Because I cannot ride away from you," Kade said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I cannot cross that river and leave you behind. I have been alone for so long, Nora, running from town to town with nothing but my horse and my saddle, and then I met you and everything changed. These past 5 days, riding with you, watching you with these children, seeing how brave and strong and kind you are, I cannot walk away. I do not want to walk away." Nora's eyes were shining with tears. "You are talking about throwing your life away." "No," Kade said, reaching out to cup her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "I am talking about choosing the life I want. And I want to be with you. I want to help you raise these children. I want to see them safe in Houston, and then I want to build something with you, something real and lasting. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to be the man you turn to when things get hard. I want to be there for you, Nora, for all of it." She let out a sob and leaned into his touch. "I am so scared," she whispered. "Scared they will catch you, scared something will happen to you because of me, scared I will lose you like I have lost everyone else." "You will not lose me," Kade promised, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight. "I swear to you, Nora, I am not going anywhere. We are going to get to Houston. We are going to get these children somewhere safe, and then we are going to figure out the rest together." She clung to him for a long moment, her face pressed against his chest, and Kade could feel her heart beating wild and fast against his own. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but determined. "Together," she repeated, "all the way to Houston." "All the way to Houston," Kade agreed, and then he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, tasting of salt tears and hope. Nora melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for a moment the whole world narrowed down to just the two of them, to the feeling of her lips on his and the warmth of her body in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kade rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "We should get moving," he said quietly. "The sooner we start for Houston, the sooner we can get there." Nora nodded, wiping her eyes, and then Thomas's voice piped up from behind them. "Are you going to marry Miss Nora?" the boy asked, his face curious and open. Kade and Nora both turned to find Thomas sitting up in his blankets, watching them with interest. Nora's face flushed crimson, but Kade just laughed. "Maybe someday if she will have me," he said honestly, glancing at Nora. "Would that be all right with you, Thomas?" The boy considered this seriously for a moment, then nodded. "Mama would have liked you," he said. "She always said we needed someone strong to look after us." Nora made a small wounded sound and went to gather Thomas into her arms, holding him close. Kade watched them, this makeshift family he had somehow found himself part of, and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was right. Dangerous and risky and possibly foolish, but right. They broke camp quickly after that, packing up the blankets and supplies, saddling the horses, making sure Sarah was secure in Nora's arms. As they mounted up, Kade took one last look at the Rio Grande in the distance, at the border he could have crossed, at the freedom he was leaving behind. Then he turned his horse north and east, toward Houston, toward the uncertain future, toward whatever came next. Nora rode up beside him, her face set with determination. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing us." "Always," Kade replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They rode hard that first day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the border. Kade figured that anyone tracking them would assume they had crossed into Mexico, would waste time searching the villages south of the Rio Grande, before figuring out they had doubled back north. It bought them a little breathing room, but not much. They needed to reach Houston as quickly as possible, needed to get the children somewhere safe before the law caught up with them. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled, the scrubby mesquite and prickly pear giving way to rolling grasslands and stands of oak trees. They avoided the main roads, sticking to game trails and cattle paths, stopping only to rest the horses and tend to the children's needs. Thomas was a brave little traveler, rarely complaining even when he was clearly tired and saddle sore. Sarah fussed more, as babies do, but Nora had a seemingly endless patience for soothing her, singing lullabies and nursery rhymes as they rode. They made camp each night in secluded spots, far from any towns or settlements where someone might recognize Kade from a wanted poster. Kade would hunt small game when he could, supplementing their dwindling supplies with rabbit or quail roasted over the campfire. Nora would wash out Sarah's cloths in whatever stream or creek they found, hanging them to dry on mesquite branches while she told Thomas stories about his mother, keeping Margaret's memory alive for the children. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Kade and Nora would sit together by the fire and talk in low voices. She told him about her childhood in Louisiana, about helping her mother in the plantation kitchen, about the summers when the heat was so oppressive that the whole household would move to sleeping porches to catch any breath of breeze. She told him about her father, a skilled carpenter who had taught her to appreciate fine craftsmanship, and her brothers, wild and rambunctious boys who had kept her on her toes. Kade, in turn, told her about growing up on a failing ranch in West Texas, about a father who drank too much and took out his frustrations on anyone within reach. He told her about running away at 15, about working cattle drives and breaking horses and taking whatever jobs he could find. He told her about the endless drifting, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots, always moving on before anyone could get too close. "I was tired of running," he admitted one night, staring into the flames. "Tired of being alone, but I did not know how to stop. Did not know what I would do if I stayed in one place, who I would be if I was not just the hired hand passing through." "And now?" Nora asked softly, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Now I want to be the man who stayed," Kade said, lacing his fingers through hers. "The man who chose love over fear, the man who built a home instead of running from one." Nora squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with emotion. "I want that too," she whispered. A home, a family, roots that go deep and hold strong. We will build it together, Kade promised. Once we get to Houston, once the children are settled, we will figure out the rest. They kissed then, longer and deeper than before, and Kade felt the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks melting away under the warmth of her touch. He did not know what the future held, but he knew he wanted Nora in it, wanted her laughter and her strength and her fierce protective love. He wanted to spend every day earning her trust, proving himself worthy of the faith she had placed in him. On the 5th day of travel northeast, they came across a small creek swollen with recent rains, too deep and fast for the horses to ford safely with Nora holding Sarah. Kade scouted up and down the bank, looking for a better crossing point, while Nora tried to keep Thomas entertained and Sarah content. He finally found a spot where a fallen oak tree bridged the water, solid and wide enough to lead the horses across. It was slow, careful work. Kade went first, coaxing his nervous mount across the slippery log, testing each step to make sure the wood would hold. Once he was across, he called back to Nora. She dismounted, handed Sarah to Thomas to hold for just a moment, and then led her horse onto the log. Halfway across, the horse spooked. Something in the water, a fish jumping or a turtle surfacing, made the animal shy sideways. Nora held tight to the reins, her feet slipping on the wet bark, and for one heart-stopping moment, Kade thought she was going to fall into the rushing water below. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm and hauling her toward solid ground, the horse scrambling behind her. They both collapsed on the bank, breathing hard, and Nora started laughing. It was a wild, slightly hysterical sound, but genuine. "That was too close," she gasped, gripping Kade's arm. "Way too close," Kade agreed, his heart still racing. "You scared 10 years off my life, woman." Nora's laughter softened into a smile and she reached up to touch his face. "But you caught me," she said wonderingly. "You always catch me." Kade covered her hand with his own, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "Always," he said again, the word becoming a vow. They got Thomas and Sarah across without further incident and camped on the far bank for the night to let the horses rest and everyone recover from the scare. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Thomas declared he was going to learn to swim so he would never be scared of water. Nora smiled and promised to teach him once they got to Houston, and Kade found himself imagining lazy summer days by a swimming hole, watching Thomas splash and play while Sarah toddled on the bank. The thought should have terrified him, this vision of domestic contentment, but instead it filled him with a deep longing. He wanted that future. He wanted to be part of this family, to see these children grow up safe and happy, to build a life with Nora that was full of ordinary joys and everyday miracles. A week into their journey, they reached the outskirts of a town called Huntsville. Kade knew they needed supplies. Their food was running dangerously low, but he was nervous about going into a town where wanted posters might already be circulating. They compromised by having Nora go in alone with the children, while Kade waited with the horses in a grove of trees outside town. She would buy what they needed and be back within an hour, quick and unremarkable. Kade paced the grove like a caged animal while she was gone, watching the road, starting at every sound. He had given her most of their remaining money and told her to buy whatever she thought they would need. But what he really wanted was to go with her, to be there if trouble arose, to protect her and the children. Being separated from them, even for an hour, felt like torture. When Nora finally returned, Sarah on her hip and Thomas walking beside her with a peppermint stick clutched in his fist, Kade nearly sagged with relief. She smiled at his obvious anxiety and handed him a bundle of food supplies along with a folded newspaper. "I thought you should see this," she said quietly. Kade unfolded the paper and felt his stomach drop. There, on the front page, was a notice about James Halstead's death. The article called it a brutal murder, claimed Kade had killed Halstead in cold blood during a robbery, and offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. There was a description that was close enough to be worrying: tall and lean with dark hair and a scar on his left forearm, armed and dangerous. "They are looking for you," Nora said unnecessarily, her face worried. "People in town were talking about it. The sheriff in Madisonville has sent notices to every town in Texas." Kade folded the newspaper and shoved it in his saddlebag, his jaw tight. "Did anyone look at you funny, ask questions?" "No," Nora said. "I was just another woman buying supplies for her family. Nobody paid me any attention." "Good," Kade said. "We need to move faster. If they are spreading word this far east, we do not have much time before someone puts together that I am traveling with a woman and 2 children." They pushed hard after that, sometimes riding into the night when the moon was bright enough to see the trail. Thomas fell asleep in the saddle more than once, slumping against Kade's back, and Sarah grew fretful from the constant motion. Nora's face became drawn with exhaustion, but she never complained, just kept going with the same determination that had made her stand up to Halstead in the first place. 10 days into their journey, they camped near a small settlement called Riverside. Kade went to scout the town at dawn, leaving Nora and the children hidden in a stand of pines. He needed to get a sense of whether the law had reached this far, whether it was safe to pass through, or if they needed to go around. He was walking down the main street, hat pulled low over his face, when he heard a voice call out. "You there? Hold up a minute." Kade's hand went instinctively to the gun at his hip, but he forced himself to turn slowly, casually, like a man with nothing to hide. A deputy was walking toward him, a middle-aged man with a badge pinned to his vest and a curious expression on his face. "Morning, officer," Kade said evenly. "Something I can help you with?" The deputy looked him up and down, eyes lingering on the scar on Kade's forearm where his sleeve had ridden up. "Maybe," the deputy said slowly. "We got a notice about a wanted man. Description matches you pretty close. You would not happen to know anything about a killing down in Madisonville, would you?" Kade's mind raced. He could run, but that would only confirm the deputy's suspicions. He could fight, but he had killed 1 man already and did not want more blood on his hands. He could try to talk his way out, but his tongue had never been as quick as his fists. "I think you have the wrong man," Kade said carefully. "I have been working a ranch north of here for the past month, have not been anywhere near Madisonville." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "That's so. What ranch would that be?" Before Kade could answer, a commotion erupted from the other end of the street. A horse had broken loose from its hitching post and was charging down the road, wild-eyed and panicked, directly toward a woman with a baby carriage. Without thinking, Kade lunged forward, grabbing the horse's trailing reins and yanking hard, using his weight to drag the animal to a halt. The horse reared and screamed, hooves flashing, but Kade held on, talking in a low, steady voice until the animal calmed. The woman with the baby carriage was crying with relief, thanking him profusely, and several townspeople had gathered to watch. The deputy was there too, looking at Kade with a new assessment in his eyes. "That was brave," the deputy said finally, "or foolish, maybe both." Kade handed the horse's reins to its owner, a sheepish-looking young man who had tied a poor knot. "Just did what needed doing," he said. The deputy studied him for another long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Get out of town," he said quietly. "Now, and do not come back this way." Kade did not wait for him to change his mind. He walked back to his horse with measured steps, mounted up, and rode out of Riverside at a pace that was just short of a gallop. His heart did not stop pounding until he was back at the camp, wrapping Nora in his arms and burying his face in her hair. "What happened?" she asked, feeling him shake. "Close call," Kade said. "Too close. We need to be more careful." After that, Kade stayed with the camp while Nora went into towns when they needed supplies. It chafed at him, hiding while she took the risks, but they both agreed it was the only way. Nora could pass unremarked, just another woman traveling with her children. Kade's face was the one on wanted posters, the one that would get them all caught. The days blurred together into a rhythm of travel and rest, of feeding children and soothing tears, of stolen kisses in the dark and whispered promises of the future. Kade found himself falling more in love with Nora with each passing day. He loved the way she sang to the children, her voice clear and sweet. He loved the fierce determination in her eyes when she talked about getting to Houston. He loved the way she looked at him, like he was something precious and worth keeping. And she was falling for him too. He could see it in the way she reached for his hand without thinking, in the way she smiled when he returned from hunting, in the way she leaned into his embrace at night. They had not spoken the words yet, had not said, "I love you" out loud, but it hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. 2 weeks into their journey, Thomas asked Kade to teach him to ride properly. The boy had been a passenger up until now, clinging to Kade's back or held secure by a makeshift sling, but he wanted to learn to control a horse himself. Kade agreed, and spent an afternoon in a meadow teaching Thomas the basics, while Nora watched with Sarah in her arms. "Hold the reins gentle, like you are holding a baby bird," Kade instructed, walking beside the horse as Thomas sat proudly in the saddle. "The horse can feel everything you do, so you want to be clear but kind." Thomas's face was scrunched in concentration, his small hands gripping the reins carefully. "Like this, just like that," Kade said, pride warming his chest. "You are a natural, Thomas. Your mama would be proud." The boy beamed, and Nora's eyes filled with tears. Later, when Thomas was playing with Sarah in the grass and the horses were grazing nearby, she came up behind Kade and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You are so good with him," she said softly. "You are good with both of them. They love you already." "I love them too," Kade said, covering her hands with his own. "And I love you, Nora. I should have said it before now, but I love you. I love you so much it scares me." Nora turned him around, her green eyes shining. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you since that first night when you promised to help us, when you put yourself in danger for children who were not yours and a woman you barely knew. I love you, Kade Lawson, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." They kissed there in the meadow, with the children playing nearby and the sun warm on their faces, and Kade felt like the luckiest man in Texas. He had chosen love over freedom, had turned away from the border to stay with this woman and these children, and it was the best decision he had ever made. 3 weeks into their journey, they were only 2 days from Houston when disaster struck. They had camped near a creek, hidden in a copse of willows, and Kade had been sure they were safe. But sometime in the night, a group of bounty hunters had tracked them down, following the trail of a woman with 2 children and a mysterious male companion that matched the descriptions coming out of Madisonville. Kade woke to the sound of men's voices and the metallic click of guns being cocked. He rolled to his feet, instinctively putting himself between the approaching threat and where Nora slept with the children, his hand going to his gun. "Do not even think about it," one of the bounty hunters said, a grizzled man with cold eyes and a rifle pointed at Kade's chest. "You are Kade Lawson, wanted for the murder of James Halstead. You are coming with us." Nora woke with a gasp, clutching Sarah to her chest, and Thomas started crying. Kade kept his hands carefully visible, away from his weapon, his mind racing for a way out. There were 4 bounty hunters, all armed, and they had the camp surrounded. Fighting would get them all killed, and running would put Nora and the children in the line of fire. It was self-defense, Kade said evenly. Halstead was beating a child. I stopped him. It was an accident that he died. That is for a judge to decide, the bounty hunter said. Now, you are going to come along nice and quiet, and maybe the woman and the children do not get hurt. Please, Nora said, her voice breaking. Please, he was protecting us. Halstead was a monster. He was going to send the children to an orphanage. He was going to— Not our problem, madam, another bounty hunter interrupted. We just collect the bounties. Law will sort out the rest. Kade looked at Nora, at her terrified face and the children clinging to her, and felt his heart shatter. He had tried so hard to keep them safe, had sacrificed his chance at freedom to see them to Houston, and now it was all falling apart. He was going to be dragged back to Madisonville in chains, and Nora would be left alone with 2 children and no resources, still 2 days from Houston. Let me say goodbye, Kade said quietly. Please, just let me say goodbye to them. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, then the leader shrugged. Make it quick. Kade crossed to where Nora sat on the ground, knelt down beside her, and pulled her and the children into his arms. Listen to me, he said urgently, his voice too low for the bounty hunters to hear. Take the horses and go to Houston. Find Margaret's family, tell them everything. They will help you. They will make sure the children are safe. No, Nora sobbed. I am not leaving you. We will figure this out. We will find a lawyer. We will— Nora, please, Kade said, framing her face in his hands. I need you to do this. I need you to take care of Thomas and Sarah. They are what matters now. Get them to safety. Promise me. Nora's tears were hot against his palms. I love you, she choked out. I love you so much. I love you too, Kade said, and kissed her one last time, trying to memorize the taste of her lips, the feel of her in his arms. Then he turned to Thomas, who was watching with huge, frightened eyes. You are the man of the family now, Thomas. You take care of your sister and Miss Nora, you hear me? You be brave and strong. Thomas threw his arms around Kade's neck. I do not want you to go. I know, buddy, Kade said, his voice cracking. But I need you to be a big boy for me. Can you do that? Thomas nodded against his shoulder, and Kade held him tight for a moment before gently disentangling himself. He stood up, turned to face the bounty hunters, and held out his hands. Let's go. They bound his wrists with rough rope and hauled him onto a horse, and the last thing Kade saw as they rode out of camp was Nora standing with the children, her face streaked with tears, watching him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. The bounty hunters took him back to Madisonville, a 3-day journey of hard riding and sleeping on the ground with his hands still tied. They did not beat him or abuse him, but they were not gentle either, and by the time they reached town, Kade was bruised and exhausted and half sick with worry about Nora and the children. The sheriff in Madisonville was a man named Porter, a friend of Halstead's and firmly in the pocket of the wealthy ranchers in the area. He threw Kade in a cell without a trial, told him he would hang within the week, and seemed to take pleasure in describing exactly how the execution would go. Kade listened to it all with a blank face, refusing to give Porter the satisfaction of seeing his fear. What he was really scared of was not dying, but of never seeing Nora again, of never knowing if she and the children made it to Houston safely. He lay on the narrow cot in his cell and stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past weeks in his mind. The way Nora's eyes had lit up when he kissed her, the sound of Thomas's laughter when they played games on horseback, the sweet weight of Sarah sleeping in his arms. All the things he was going to lose, On the third day of his imprisonment, the cell door opened and a woman walked in. It was not Nora. This woman was older, maybe 40, with the same chestnut hair but threaded with silver, and eyes that were hazel rather than green. She carried herself with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, and she looked at Kade with an expression that was equal parts assessment and determination. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "my name is Catherine Wells. I was Margaret Halstead's elder sister." Kade sat up on the cot, his heart suddenly racing. "Madam, is Nora or the children, they are safe," Catherine said quickly. "They arrived at my home in Houston 4 days ago. Nora told me everything about James, about what he was planning to do to my niece and nephew, about how you protected them and helped them escape. She also told me you killed my brother-in-law." Kade swallowed hard. "Yes, madam, I did. He was hurting Thomas, and I lost my temper," and Catherine held up a hand. "James Halstead was a brute and a drunk, and my sister's life became a misery after she married him. I tried to convince her to leave him more than once, but she was stubborn and believed in honoring her vows. When she died, I wanted to take the children myself, but James refused. He had legal custody and there was nothing I could do." Her expression hardened. "Until now." "I do not understand," Kade said. "I have been making some inquiries," Catherine said. "Speaking to people in Madisonville, people who worked on the Halstead ranch, people who saw how James treated those children after Margaret died. I have collected sworn statements from 3 different ranch hands who witnessed James hitting Thomas on multiple occasions. I have a statement from the doctor who treated Thomas for a broken arm last year, an injury James claimed was from a fall but which the doctor suspected was from abuse. I have built a case that James Halstead was a danger to his own children, and that you acted to protect them." Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in Kade's chest. "Will that be enough to save me from hanging?" "I've hired the best lawyer in Houston," Catherine said. "He is arguing that you acted in defense of a child, that Halstead's death was accidental, and that you should be charged with manslaughter at worst, not murder. The trial starts tomorrow, and I am going to testify on your behalf." "Why?" Kade asked, his voice rough. "Why would you do this for me?" Catherine's expression softened. "Because Nora loves you. Because my niece and nephew love you. Because you gave up your own freedom to help a woman you barely knew, and you turned away from a guaranteed escape to make sure they reached safety. That is the kind of man my sister would have wanted in her children's lives." She paused, then added, "And because if you hang, Nora will never forgive herself, and I do not want to watch another woman I care about destroy herself over a man." The trial was held in the Madisonville courthouse, a sweltering room packed with curious townspeople. Kade stood before the judge in chains, his heart pounding, while Catherine's lawyer argued his case. The prosecutor painted Kade as a drifter and a murderer, a violent man who had killed James Halstead in cold blood and stolen his children. But Catherine's lawyer countered with the sworn statements, with testimony from people who had seen Halstead's cruelty, with evidence that Kade had acted to protect a child. Then Catherine herself took the stand, dignified and composed, and told the court about her sister's marriage, about the abuse the children had suffered, about her own failed attempts to intervene. She described how Nora had written to her weeks before the incident, begging for help, saying she was terrified of what Halstead might do. The letter had arrived too late for Catherine to act, but it corroborated everything Kade and Nora had claimed. Finally, Nora was called to testify. Kade had not known she was in Madisonville, had assumed she was safely in Houston with the children, and seeing her walk into the courtroom nearly undid him. She was pale and visibly frightened, but she held her head high as she took the stand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor tried to tear her apart, implying she had been Cade's accomplice, suggesting she had seduced him into killing Halstead so she could run away with him and claim the children. But Nora answered every question with quiet honesty, describing Halstead's abuse, the threats he had made, the way Cade had arrived and offered help. She told the court about finding Halstead in the barn with Thomas, about the blood on the little boy's face, about how Cade had acted to stop the beating. "He saved Thomas's life," Nora said, her voice shaking but clear. "And then he saved all of us. He could have crossed the border into Mexico and been free, but he turned back to help me get the children to Houston. He risked everything for us. If that is the act of a murderer, then I do not understand what justice means." The courtroom was silent when she finished. The judge, an older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, looked at Cade for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Mr. Lawson, you killed a man. That is a fact that cannot be disputed. But the evidence presented suggests you did so while defending a child from harm, and that James Halstead's death was unintentional, the result of a tragic accident rather than malicious intent." He paused. "In light of the testimony and evidence presented, I am ruling this a case of justifiable homicide in defense of another. You are free to go." The courtroom erupted in noise, some people shouting in agreement, others protesting. Cade barely heard any of it. He was focused on Nora, who had burst into tears, and on the fact that the bailiff was unlocking his chains. He was free. He was actually free. Nora flew into his arms the moment the chains were off, and Cade lifted her off her feet, spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. "You came back," he said, holding her tight. "You came back to Madisonville. You put yourself at risk." "I had to testify," Nora said, pulling back to look at him. "I had to make them understand. I could not let you hang for saving us." "You are the bravest, most infuriating woman I have ever met," Cade said, and kissed her right there in the courtroom, not caring who was watching. Catherine approached them after the crowd cleared out, a smile on her face. "Well, Mr. Lawson, it seems you are a free man. What do you plan to do now?" Cade looked at Nora, saw the love and hope shining in her eyes, and knew exactly what he wanted. "I plan to marry this woman if she will have me. And then I plan to help her raise those children and build the life we have been dreaming about." "Yes," Nora said immediately, not even waiting for him to formally ask. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in Houston, in the parlor of Catherine's elegant home with Thomas and Sarah as witnesses. Thomas took his role very seriously, standing beside Cade in a suit that Catherine had bought for him, and Sarah toddled around with flower petals clutched in her chubby fists. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress, and she was the most beautiful thing Cade had ever seen. Catherine hosted a small reception after the ceremony, inviting a few close friends and members of Margaret's family who were eager to meet the man who had saved her children. Cade was overwhelmed by their warmth and acceptance, by the way they welcomed him into the family without question. Thomas's uncle, a banker named Robert, even offered Cade a job managing one of his properties, a small ranch outside Houston that needed a good foreman. "It is not charity," Robert said when Cade hesitated. "You know cattle and horses, and I need someone I can trust to run the operation. The house on the property is yours, big enough for a family, and the pay is fair. Think of it as an investment in my niece and nephew's future. I want them to grow up knowing the man who saved them." Cade accepted, his throat tight with gratitude, and Nora squeezed his hand so hard he thought she might break his fingers. They moved into the ranch house a month later, a sturdy 2-story building with a wide porch and enough bedrooms for everyone. Thomas was thrilled to have his own room, and Sarah's nursery had windows that looked out over the pastures where horses grazed. Nora spent days decorating, hanging curtains and arranging furniture, turning the house into a home. Kade threw himself into the work of running the ranch, earning the respect of the hands with his fair leadership and hard work. He was up before dawn every day, mending fences and moving cattle, breaking horses and checking water sources. It was exhausting physical labor, but it was honest work, and at the end of each day he got to come home to Nora and the children, to warm meals and laughter and love. Thomas thrived in the new environment. He had space to run and play, horses to learn to ride, and a grandfather figure in Robert who visited often and taught him to fish. The nightmares that had plagued him after Halstead's abuse slowly faded, replaced by the simple joys of childhood. He called Kade Papa within 6 months, saying it tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, and Kade felt his heart swell every time he heard it. Sarah grew from a baby into a toddler, then a little girl with her mother's brown curls and sweet disposition. She followed Kade around the ranch like a shadow, begging to be lifted onto horses, collecting chicken eggs with him, falling asleep in his lap while he worked on accounts in the evening. She had no memory of her biological father, knew only Kade as her papa, and he loved her with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him. Nora settled into her role as a rancher's wife with the same determination she brought to everything else. She learned to manage the household accounts, to preserve food for winter, to treat minor injuries that happened on a working ranch. She also started teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of the ranch hands, turning one of the outbuildings into a small schoolroom. It gave her purpose and joy, using her education to help others, and Kade loved watching her light up as she worked with the students. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight at times, especially when a drought hit and they lost cattle. Kade struggled with nightmares about Halstead, about the moment when everything had gone wrong, and Nora would wake to find him sitting on the porch in the dark, trying to calm his racing heart. They argued sometimes, about money or discipline with the children or the 100 small things that married couples argue about, but they always talked it through, always came back to the love that bound them together. 2 years after their wedding, Nora told Kade she was expecting a child. He had been in the barn fixing a saddle when she found him, her face glowing with happiness and nerves. "I am pregnant," she said simply, and Kade dropped the saddle, crossed to her in 2 long strides and picked her up, spinning her around just like he had in the courtroom. "We are having a baby," he said wonderingly, setting her down and placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Nora asked, searching his face. "I am so happy I could burst," Kade said, kissing her. "I love you so much, Nora. You have given me everything, a home and a family and a reason to wake up in the morning. Now you are giving me a child. I do not have words for what I am feeling." Thomas and Sarah were thrilled when they told them. Thomas declared he would teach the baby everything he knew, and Sarah insisted on sleeping with her hand on Nora's stomach so she could talk to the baby and tell it to hurry up. The pregnancy was not easy. Nora suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, she found the Texas heat increasingly oppressive. But Kade was attentive and patient, bringing her cool water and fanning her when she was overheated, rubbing her swollen feet and reading to her in the evenings. Thomas and Sarah helped too, bringing their mother wildflowers and drawing pictures to cheer her up. In the spring of 1882, on a warm April morning with wildflowers blooming across the ranch, Nora went into labor. Catherine arrived from Houston to help with the delivery, and Kade spent the longest hours of his life pacing the porch while Nora labored upstairs. Thomas and Sarah stayed with a neighbor, spared the anxiety of waiting, and Kade was left alone with his fears. What if something went wrong? What if he lost her like Margaret had been lost? What if the baby did not survive? The thoughts spun through his mind in an endless loop until he thought he might go mad. Then, just as the sun was setting, he heard a baby's cry. Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling. "Come meet your son," she said. Kade took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into the bedroom. Nora was propped up against pillows, exhausted and sweaty and absolutely radiant, with a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at Kade with tears streaming down her face and held out the baby. "His name is James," she said softly. "James Kade Lawson, after your middle name, and so there will be a good James to replace the bad one in the family history." Kade took his son with shaking hands, looking down at the impossibly small face, the tiny fingers that curled around his thumb, the downy dark hair. "He is perfect," Kade whispered, his voice breaking. "Nora, he is perfect. We made him," Nora said, smiling through her tears. "You and me. We made this beautiful little life." Kade sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her, and they looked at their son together. This tiny person who was half him and half Nora, who represented their love and their future. Kade felt like his heart might explode from the sheer weight of his joy. Thomas and Sarah met their baby brother the next day and were instantly smitten. Thomas wanted to hold him right away, sitting very still and serious with James in his lap, and Sarah kissed the baby's head and declared he was the best baby ever. They fell into their roles as big siblings with ease, helping to fetch diapers and singing lullabies and competing to see who could make James smile first. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, now with an infant in the mix. Kade learned to function on broken sleep, rocking James at 3 in the morning while Nora caught a few hours of rest. He changed diapers and learned to swaddle, and discovered that he had a talent for getting the baby to stop crying with silly faces and off-key singing. James grew from an infant into a chubby, happy baby with Kade's dark hair and Nora's green eyes. He was a sweet-natured child, quick to smile and laugh, and watching him develop his personality was one of the greatest joys of Kade's life. He took James with him around the ranch as soon as the baby was old enough, carrying him in a sling while he worked, talking to him about the horses and cattle even though James was too young to understand. 2 years after James was born, Nora announced she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the winter of 1884 they welcomed a daughter they named Grace Margaret, after the virtue and the woman who had brought them together. Grace was a fiery child from the start, loud and demanding, with a temper that made them all laugh. She had Nora's chestnut hair and a stubborn streak a mile wide. With 4 children now, the house was full of noise and chaos and love. Kade built an addition onto the house, creating more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, and Nora joked that they were going to need a bigger dining table soon if they kept having children. Kade said he would be happy to have a dozen more if it meant every one of them came from her. The years passed in a blur of milestones and memories. Thomas grew into a capable young man who worked alongside Kade on the ranch, learning the business and proving himself a natural leader. Sarah became a skilled rider and developed a passion for painting, covering the walls of her room with watercolors of the ranch and the Texas landscape. James was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful and loved to read, often hiding in the barn loft with a book when he was supposed to be doing chores. Grace was a whirlwind of energy, climbing trees and getting into mischief, keeping them all on their toes. Catherine remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting often and spoiling the children with gifts and affection. Robert continued to be a mentor to Kade, teaching him about business and finance, helping him expand the ranch over the years. Margaret's family embraced Kade and Nora completely, including them in holidays and celebrations, treating them as cherished members of the clan. Kade never forgot the day he turned away from the Rio Grande. He thought about it sometimes, usually late at night when the house was quiet and Nora was asleep beside him. He thought about the border he could have crossed, the freedom he could have claimed, the life he could have lived in Mexico. And every single time, he was grateful he had turned back. Because this life, this chaotic, beautiful, full-hearted life, was worth more than any freedom. Waking up next to Nora every morning, watching her hair turn silver at the temples as they aged together, was worth more than 1,000 safe havens south of the border. Hearing his children call him Papa, watching them grow and thrive, was worth more than any risk he had taken to get them to safety. He had chosen love over fear, family over freedom, and it had been the rightest choice of his life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kade took Nora on a trip, just the two of them, leaving the children with Catherine for a week. They rode out to the same meadow where he had taught Thomas to ride, where they had first said, "I love you" to each other, and made camp under the stars like they had during those desperate weeks fleeing to Houston. "You ever regret it?" Nora asked as they lay together, wrapped in blankets, looking up at the night sky. "Turning back from the border, giving up your chance to escape?" "Never," Kade said immediately, pulling her closer. "Not for a single second. You and the children, this life we have built, it is everything I never knew I wanted. You saved me, Nora. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to put down roots. You gave me a home." "We saved each other," Nora corrected, turning in his arms to look at him. "I was trapped and scared, and you gave me hope. You gave me and the children a future. And you gave me a love I never thought I would find, a partner who chooses me every single day." Kade kissed her then, slow and deep, tasting the decade of love and life they had built together. "I will choose you every day for the rest of my life," he promised. "Every single day, Nora, you and our family. That is my purpose. That is my joy." They made love under the stars, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. And afterward they talked about everything and nothing, about their dreams for the children and plans for the ranch, about the gray in Kade's hair and the laugh lines around Nora's eyes. They talked about Thomas, who was courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, and Sarah's dream of studying art in the East. They talked about James's quiet brilliance and Grace's wild spirit, about the grandchildren they hoped to have someday. When they returned to the ranch, the children rushed out to greet them, talking over each other about everything that had happened while they were gone. James had finished a whole book. Grace had climbed to the top of the oak tree by the creek. Thomas had helped birth a foal. Sarah had completed a painting of the sunset that was hanging in the parlor. Kade and Nora listened to it all, laughing and hugging each child, soaking in the warmth and love of their family. This was home. This was everything. The years continued to roll by, bringing new joys and inevitable sorrows. Catherine passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 63, and Nora grieved the woman who had become a second mother to her. Robert followed a few years later, leaving Thomas a share in the ranch business and ensuring the family's financial security for generations. Kade's body started to show the wear of decades of hard ranch work, his knees aching in cold weather, his back stiff in the mornings, but he kept working because the work gave him purpose. Thomas married his sweetheart when he was 22, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property, close enough to be part of the family but far enough for their own privacy. Within a year, they gave Kade and Nora their first grandchild, a girl named Emma who had Nora's eyes and Thomas's smile. Kade cried the first time he held her, overcome with the realization that the children he had helped save were now parents themselves, continuing the cycle of love and family. Sarah did go east to study art, spending 3 years at a school in Boston before returning to Texas with a refined technique and a portfolio of stunning work. She opened a studio in Houston and became known for her paintings of the Texas landscape, supporting herself comfortably and never marrying, claiming she was wedded to her art. Kade and Nora worried about her sometimes, but she was happy and fulfilled, and that was all they could ask. James surprised them all by becoming a lawyer, using his quiet intelligence and love of books to fight for people who could not afford legal representation. He made far less money than he could have, but he came home glowing with satisfaction every time he won a case for someone who had been wronged. He reminded Kade of the lawyer who had saved his life, and Kade could not have been prouder. Grace, true to her wild nature, fell in love with the son of a horse breeder and moved to Kentucky to raise thoroughbreds. She wrote home often, her letters full of excitement about races and bloodlines in the bluegrass country she had come to love. She visited every Christmas with her growing brood of children, filling the house with noise and chaos in the best possible way. Kade and Nora grew old together, their hair turning white, their bodies slowing down, but their love never dimming. They sat on the porch every evening, watching the sun set over the ranch, holding hands and talking about their day. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the house bursting at the seams with family. On a warm spring day when Kade was 73, he was out checking fences when he felt a pain in his chest. He managed to make it back to the house, to the porch where Nora was shelling peas, and collapsed into her arms. She held him and called for help, but they both knew it was too late. "I love you," Kade whispered, looking up at her face, still beautiful to him after all these years. "I loved you from the moment I saw you standing up to Halstead. I loved you every day of our life together. It has been the greatest honor of my life to be your husband." "I love you too," Nora said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for turning back from that border. Thank you for every day, every moment, every single beautiful year." "Would do it again," Kade said, his voice fading. "In a heartbeat. You were worth everything." He died there in her arms, on the porch of the home they had built together, surrounded by the life they had created. The funeral was huge, attended by family and friends and ranch hands and people from all over who had been touched by Kade's kindness and integrity. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree where he used to sit with the children and tell them stories. Nora lived another 5 years after Kade's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still teaching reading to ranch children, still tending her garden, still fierce and strong even as her body weakened. She talked about Kade every day, keeping his memory alive, and everyone who knew her could see that part of her heart had died with him. When Nora passed away peacefully in her sleep at 78, they buried her next to Kade under that oak tree. Thomas gave the eulogy, talking about two people who had loved each other so completely that they had changed the lives of everyone around them. He talked about the cowboy who had turned back from the border for a woman and her children, who had chosen love over freedom and built a legacy that would last for generations. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the family, a testament to the love and hard work of Kade and Nora Lawson. Their story became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder that the bravest choices are often the ones made with the heart. That love is worth any risk, any sacrifice, any turning away from safety to embrace the unknown. And on warm evenings when the sun sets over the Texas hills and the breeze rustles through the oak tree on the hill, some say you can still feel them there, Kade and Nora, hand in hand, watching over the family they created, the home they built, the love that never died. Their story had started with a desperate woman trying to protect two children, with a cowboy facing the choice between freedom and love. It ended with generations of family, with a ranch that bore their name, with love that rippled outward, touching countless lives. Kade had stood at the Rio Grande with Mexico shimmering before him, with escape within reach, and he had turned his horse around and ridden back to a woman with green eyes and children who needed him. It was the moment that defined his life, the choice that made him who he was meant to be. Not a drifter running from his past, but a man who stayed, who built, who loved with his whole heart. A man who understood that real freedom was not found in crossing borders, but in choosing to be bound to the people and places and purposes that gave life meaning. He could have crossed the border free. Instead, the cowboy turned back for her and the children, and in doing so, he found something far more valuable than freedom. He found home,